Now, the rest of the story. At first it was like a distant, horrible echo, rising up from the depths of slumber. And then suddenly Fanny realized that the terrible screaming was real. It was coming from her husband, Bob, as he lay next to her in bed. She sat upright, gazed down at him through the gloom. He was still asleep and still crying out, as though some awful thing had hold of him. Fanny grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him hard. Whatever it was had invaded his sleep. She must make it let go. Bob awakened with a start, his eyes suddenly wide open, and at once both of them knew the nightmare was back. It had begun when Bob was a boy in Edinburgh, a succession of disquieting dreams that seemed so real, so vivid as life itself during his waking hours. Eventually it became so difficult to distinguish between reality and these nocturnal fantasies that Bob went to a doctor. A strong sedative was prescribed. Gradually the dreams went away until tonight. Now once again the horror was stalking him. Bob, a frail invalid, could tolerate no more medication, so there'd be only one way to exorcise these demons from his brain. He must recount the grotesqueries that he experienced in his latest dream as precisely as he could possibly remember them. He must write them down, and this the following morning at daybreak, propped up in bed, he began. And all day, inhabitants of the house tiptoed about, not wishing to interfere with Bob's obsessive labor. His doctor, aware of the strain and yet unable to dissuade his patient from these efforts, permitted one visitor at a time for no longer than 15 minutes. Fanny, particularly concerned, stood guard at the bedroom door, attempting to enforce doctor's orders, occasionally leaning in to ask whether perhaps her husband would like to rest for a while. He would not. But he appeared so exhausted that Fanny would exclaim, to which Bob would respond only with a scratching of his pen across page after page. 3 days and 30,000 handwritten words later, 30,000 words later, the account was complete, but something was not quite right. Bob's dream was more than a succession of fantasy events. He now realized it was an allegory, that somehow he had missed it. Enraged by this oversight, he cast the entire manuscript into the fireplace and watched it burn, and began again. Went back to work, writing in bed 3 more days, 30,000 more words, and this time he got it right. As far as anyone knows, the nightmare never returned. Not to Bob, anyway, for now it was loose in the world, like the dark creatures escaped from Pandora's box. And nothing ever again will push that nightmare back into the dark. For once upon a time there was a boy in Edinburgh, terrorized by lifelike dreams in which he led a frightening double life. A double life. And those dreams later came back to haunt him. But he passed them along to you. Of course, the world remembers Bob as master author Robert Louis Stevenson. But now you know better the 2 men he became when he closed his eyes, the good Dr. Jekyll and the malevolent Mr. Hyde. Because now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has been one of my favorite stories ever since I was a child. I've always been fascinated with spooky stories such as this masterpiece by Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, I wasn't alone in my fascination with this tale. It's one of the most famous pieces of English literature and is considered a definitive book in the Gothic horror genre. Most Americans, myself included, have always pronounced the doctor's name as Jekyll, though Robert Louis Stevenson argued that it was pronounced Jekyll. Forgive me if I mispronounce it. Old habits die hard. Robert Louis Stevenson went by his middle name, Louis. He was named after his grandfathers. His paternal grandfather was Robert Stevenson, and his maternal grandfather was Louis Balfour. Robert Louis Stevenson. Louis was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in November 1850. He inherited what doctors refer to as a weak chest. He inherited it from his mother and maternal grandfather. They were constantly ill when they lived in damp climates. Lewis and his mother suffered from coughs and fevers most of their lives. At the time, doctors said their suffering was from tuberculosis, but recent research leans more to bronchiectasis. It was a disease in which there is a permanent enlargement of parts of the airways of the lungs. Symptoms typically include a chronic cough with mucus production. As a child, Lewis struggled to fit in at school because of his frequent absences due to sickness. He learned to read when he was 7 or 8 years old, much older than the other affluent children. He was certainly affluent. When he was ill, his nurse Allison Cunningham cared for him, read to him, and shared her knowledge of folk beliefs with him, which may have been the source of many of his nightmares. Lewis dedicated his 1885 book entitled A Child's Garden of Verses to her, and referred to her in the dedication as the angel of my infant life. It is possible that the seed of Jekyll and Hyde was planted by his beloved nurse. See, there again, I said Jekyll and Hyde, not Jekyll and Hyde. Even before Lewis learned to read, he was creating his own stories, which he dictated to his mother, his nurse, or to one of his many tutors. Lewis's father, Thomas, was supportive of Lewis's desire to write. You see, Thomas had been interested in writing as well as a young boy, but his father told him to give up such nonsense and mind your business. Lewis's father and grandfather's business was lighthouse engineering. Thomas may have given up on writing, but he paid for the printing of 16-year-old Lewis's first book, a history entitled The Pentland Rising, a page of history, 1666. Each year on school breaks, Lewis traveled with his family to inspect the numerous lighthouses they had built. But Lewis had no interest in engineering and lighthouse designing. He preferred writing. In 1887, he published a collection of poems, including one in which he explained his choice. Say not of me that weakly I declined the labors of my sires and fled the sea, the towers we founded and the lamps we lit, to play at home with paper like a child. Since he wasn't interested in engineering, his father sent him to law school, which he completed at the age of 24. But he never practiced law either. He was more interested in writing and traveling. In 1876, while on a canoeing trip in France, he met Fanny Vandergrift Osborne. Now, Fanny was an American divorcee with children. She was a noted magazine short story writer. Lewis and Fanny became lovers. In 1878, Fanny and her children returned to San Francisco. In the following year, Lewis traveled to New York on a steamship, then traveled overland by train en route to California to be with Fanny and the children. His health began to deteriorate as the train trip began. By the time he arrived in Monterey, less than 130 miles from San Francisco, he was said to be so near death that he was too ill to remain on the train, and someone checked him into this hotel. It was called the French Hotel, and some local ranchers slowly nursed him back to health. The hotel still exists and is now a museum called the Robert Louis Stevenson House. When Lewis and Fanny married in 1880, he wrote that he was a mere complication of cough and bones, much fitter for an emblem of mortality than a bridegroom. In 1884, Lewis, Fanny, and her children moved into this house in Bournemouth, England, to take advantage of the sea air. He named the house Scaryvore House after a lighthouse his uncle had built. His health did not improve at Scaryvore House. He was bedridden for much of the time, but he continued to write from his sickbed. It was here, at Scaryvore House, where Lewis wrote part of Treasure Island, one of my favorites. He also wrote Kidnapped here, and, of course, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Lewis racked his brain trying to come up with a unique story when he had a dream, or maybe it was a nightmare, which was the basis for Jekyll and Hyde. Lewis's wife Fanny said, In the small hours of one morning, I was awakened by cries of horror from Lewis. Thinking he had had a nightmare, I awakened him. He said angrily, "Why did you wake me? I was dreaming a fine bogey tale." I had awakened him at the first transformation scene. This is where Dr. Jekyll transforms into the savage Mr. Edward Hyde. My favorite visual representation of this transformation scene is from the 1931 film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Friedrich March. It's my favorite film version of the book. Before Lewis wrote Jekyll and Hyde, he befriended a former reverend in Bournemouth named Walter Jekyll. That's how he came up with the name of Dr. Jekyll. Now, I was unable to determine the origin of the name Hyde. Writing Jekyll and Hyde came easy for Lewis despite his illness. Lewis's stepson Lloyd later wrote, "I don't believe that there was ever such a literary feat before as the writing of Dr. Jekyll. I remember the first reading as though it were yesterday. Lewis came downstairs in a fever, read nearly half the book aloud, and then, while we were still gasping, he was away again and busy writing. I doubt if the first draft took so long as 3 days." The first draft is the one Lewis purportedly destroyed in the fireplace. Fanny read Lewis's writings, including Jekyll and Hyde, and made suggestions which she noted in the margins. The common belief is that she suggested that it was an allegory, which was not at all what Lewis intended, which led to the burning of that first draft. If it happened, no one in his family recorded it. If such a dramatic event had occurred, surely Lewis's stepson Lloyd would have mentioned it in his description of Lewis's creation of the story. Whether he burned the first draft will forever remain a mystery, but we know he wrote a second draft. This one took at least 3 days, but as many as 6 days, which is unbelievably fast. Some recent biographers argued that he was under the influence of cocaine or other drugs. But according to Lewis and every other member of his family who was present at the time, Lewis was bedridden and sick while writing it. The house where Lewis wrote Jekyll and Hyde no longer exists. On November 16, 1940, during World War II, the home was destroyed by German bombs. Only the footprint of the original home remains. The home site is now a public park with benches and a replica of the Skerryvore Lighthouse, Lewis's home's namesake. Lewis only lived in the home for 3 or 4 years. In 1887, Lewis's father died, and his own health had not improved at Skerryvore House, so on the advice of his doctor, Lewis and his family, including his widowed mother, moved to the United States. Now, his plan was to settle in Colorado, but his health declined during the sea voyage. He learned about a cure cottage, a treatment center for tuberculosis at Saranac Lake, New York. The cure cottage where Lewis stayed is now called Robert Louis Stevenson Cottage. He and his family stayed at the cottage through the winter and went to San Francisco in the spring. He spent the next 6 years traveling throughout the Pacific Ocean with his family. He spent a lot of time in Hawaii, in the Gilbert Islands, and on the Samoan Islands. It was there, at his house in Valima, Samoa, on December 3, 1894, that he was either opening a bottle of wine or making mayonnaise, sources vary, when he suddenly turned to his wife and said, "What's that?" He looked at Fanny and asked, "Does my face look strange?" Then he collapsed. He died a few hours later from what doctors at the time thought was a stroke. 44-year-old Robert Louis Stevenson was buried at the 1,300-foot summit of Mount Via. You can still visit his tomb in his nearby museum. Although Lewis has been gone for more than 130 years, people still enjoy his writings. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has been made into plays, radio dramas, and numerous films. It's a story I plan to share with my son when he's old enough. Now, I want to tell you about another story, this one true, that I'm also going to wait a few years before sharing with my son. It's a book I've written called The Trap, the untold story of Sheriff Henderson Jordan in the final pursuit of Bonnie and Clyde. It details their crime spree in a play-by-play fashion and explains how it was Sheriff Henderson Jordan, not Frank Hamer, who located the gang's hideout, learned when and where to find them, and led the posse which ended their violent crime spree. You can pre-order a copy by scanning this QR code or by visiting www.hendersonjordan.com. The book will be available on Amazon and other bookstores on May the 23rd, the anniversary of the ambush. I hope you enjoy it. I'm Brad Dison. As always, thank you very much for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.